Stalin famously was good at two things. One, killing Nazis, and two, mogging the camera.
So basically, this photo was taken on the creaky and creepy glass elevator in Sama, output of the day. So basically, I went to the Contemporary Gallery and I was looking around for a couple minutes before I landed on this. I knew it was communism. I saw the red and I got the vibe. Real recognizes real. I know my people when I see my people. What drew me in initially was the frame. I thought the frame was pretty cool. It was striped. It looked interesting. And then there were a couple hints to me as to what this was. I immediately clocked it was from Russia, but there's a couple things in there that tell me this, which there's a statue of, I believe, Lenin, or it could be Stalin at this point when it was painted, with a large red star. So the large red star is usually indicative of a communist symbol. And the fact that it could be Lenin reminded me of one of his favorite pieces that he wrote, with Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Really good piece, recommend it, please go read. And then the next thing was the brutalist architecture. It did not look like Western Europe, even though there were other communist parties in Western Europe. It does not look like Western Europe in that painting, so I knew it wasn't there. Moreover, there's the funky E at the top, which is more pronounced. If we're speaking literally, it's more pronounced like in EH. So I knew it was Russian based on the character as well. So that those are the like immediate indicators to me as to what this could be, what this painting could be about. The painting is called The 7th of November, Moscow. It was painted in 1928 by Diego Rivera. So the painting is meant to depict the 10th annual anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. It is a scene of the Russian military parading through Moscow's Red Square. Diego Rivera arrived in 1927 as part of the Mexican delegation from the Anti-Imperialist League of Americas. The Bolsheviks invited him to the anniversary to help build an international coalition. There were two Russian revolutions in 1917. The first overthrew the Tsar in February, and the second was in October when the Bolsheviks took power. The Bolsheviks were followers of Lenin in the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. The Bolsheviks were not unopposed in their ruling of Russia, and Russia went through a civil war from 1918 to 1920, which was between the Bolsheviks and multiple other parties in opposition. Some were fellow socialists and others were not. After the Civil War, Russia became known as the Soviet Union and then later formally became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, in 1922. Lenin died in 1924 and a schism emerged in the party of who would succeed him, Trotsky or Stalin. Contrary to popular myth or popular belief in some leftist circles, Trotsky is not the spiritual successor of Lenin. I have my critiques of both Trotsky and Stalin, but Trotsky had never been the clear successor to Lenin in the party. So there was a lot of tension between the two, and there was a lot of infighting within the Bolshevik. By 1928, when the painting was complete, Stalin had concretely taken power of the Bolshevik Party and had begun the 5-year plan, which involved rapid industrialization and collectivization of agriculture. He ended the new economic plan in favor of a centralized command economy. The Anti-Imperialist League of the Americas was originally founded in 1889 to oppose the U.S. annexing the Philippines. The League was a relatively diverse organization which had communists, workers, and capitalists alike. Andrew Carnegie is listed amongst one of the notable members of the organization. Diego Rivera was part of the Mexican Communist Party until 1925. After that, he shifted his focus to demonstrating his dedication to Marxism through art. Rivera became an active member of his chapter of the Anti-Imperialist League, and he became the director of its publication, El Libertador. Rivera was a supporter of Trotsky, and he was ultimately asked to leave Russia after the completion of the painting due to disagreements with the Stalin regime. In Clement Greenberg's Avant-Garde and Kitsch on page 4, he says, "It was no accident, therefore, that the birth of the avant-garde coincided chronologically and geographically, too, with the first bold development of scientific revolutionary thought in Europe." What Greenberg is saying here is that the avant-garde was born from criticism of the bourgeoisie society. Later on, he goes on to say that basically artists of the avant garde want to completely reject politics and are uninterested in it. Instead, they want to create art for art's sake. However, there is no divorcing art from politics because inherently a piece of art is going to be impacted by an artist's ideology and their implicit biases with what they were socialized as. And another part of that is the existence of having the avant garde, which is high art, versus kitsch, which is seen as low art, inherently embraces and also reaffirms class distinctions between people. That there is a high class of people and that there is a low class. So there's no such thing as art for art's sake. Art is always political. Everything is political if you look hard enough at it, coming from a political science major. Rivera's painting is very clearly political in this instance. He is embracing revolutionary thought, and the painting is very clearly supposed to be a celebration of the 10th annual parade for when the Bolsheviks took power in Russia. I want to add to the fact that the whole idea of having art for art's sake, it gives the same sort of plausible deniability that exists in intentionalism. Like, oh, I'm just doing art. There's no other meaning to it more than the fact that it is beautiful and it exists because art. Um, in a similar way to where meaning is assigned to whatever the artist intended it to be, um, because it is theirs, which I think is a terrible argument, but I'll get into that in a moment. In The Intentional Fallacy, Wilmsat and Beardsley say, if the poet succeeded in doing it, then the poem itself shows what he is trying to do. And if the poet did not succeed, then the poem is not adequate evidence, and the critic must go outside the poem on page 2. In this particular piece, I think Rivera succeeded in immediately getting his intent across in the painting. I didn't know exactly what was being depicted as far as like what, but I knew it was a parade. I knew it was celebrating communism, and I knew it wasn't Russia. And I think that is at the very essence of what he was trying to do. So I feel like that effectively is communicating the intent behind the painting. And I think part of understanding the intent behind an artist is not dependent on the artist's interpretation or the artist's intended meaning for the work, even though Rivera did a good job of communicating that. That's not the case for every single work. And I still think the interpretation of intent is largely dependent on the audience. And part of that is the pre-existing schema and the ideology of whoever is in the audience viewing said artwork, because everybody is socialized with certain biases in mind which inherently shape the way that they view the world. Nobody can escape propaganda. You can try your best to unlearn propaganda. You can try your best to deconstruct implicit biases that have been taught and reaffirmed within you from structures in society today, whether it be capitalism, homophobia, patriarchy, etc., etc., etc. However, you cannot necessarily escape those biases entirely, especially if you are not part of a marginalized group that is impacted by those issues. Um, so the idea of constantly being aware of those privileged blind spots is important, and not being aware of them or being aware of them can equally shape how art is interpreted regardless of the intent of the artist. What I find to be both in Greenberg's work and the intentional fallacy is the idea of plausible deniability. I talked about this earlier, but in Greenberg, avant garde artists want art for art's sake, and then you have artists that use their intent to say, that's the meaning of whatever I created. I think both of these I find to be problematic because they both ignore the role of how social conditioning and propaganda plays into the way we view the world. Propaganda isn't something you can escape, no matter how quote unquote woke you are. Even though the word woke has become sort of a meme, I'm just using it colloquially because that's what people know it for. Art cannot exist independent from the biases people are socially conditioned to have, in the same way that just because an artist might interpret something seemingly monotonous, that doesn't mean that monotonous thing can't be problematic. It's just not seen as problematic in the artist's eyes because they do not have enough awareness to know that it's problematic. So it's ignorance. Or they're just willing to be, or it's a willful ignorance, or it's a disingenuous type thing to deflect away from accountability. And I feel like the same thing can be said for the art for art's sake as a way to deflect against responsibility for genuinely problematic things. I know in class we spoke about like the Humpty Dumpty argument, or thing, or words losing their meaning, or communication effectively breaking down if intent what, or if intentionalism was true. Those are the philosophical arguments, and I don't disagree with them. I think they're fine. However, I am more concerned with the ethical and moral implications of people using intentionalism and twisting it in such a way for it to be used for sinister purposes. I feel like there is space to have good faith conversations about someone who had a good intention but didn't necessarily mean to cause harm, but they do anyway. I think you can have a good faith conversation and have an understanding of that. However, that doesn't change the harm that they've done in that case. It just makes it so that that person is willing to learn from their mistakes and grow from them. My general conclusion is that all individuals are unique. However, interpretation is not. Interpretation is not unique for the fact that it is shaped by our ideology, which is informed by the social conditioning and the propaganda we are exposed to maintain certain attitudes or prevailing ideas, to maintain inherently bigoted institutions, whether we are talking about the patriarchy, whether we are talking about capitalism, whether we are talking about white supremacy. these are all interconnected things in different ways, and it would take a lot more time to explain them all. But inherently, our attitudes are are molded to be partial and biased towards these systems of existence because that is the status quo. These things can be unlearned, but not easily. And regardless of intention, the impact of what is created is significantly more important than whatever the original purpose of the artwork is for. Everything is political,